Some card games require partners. Some card games you play you against others, but some you have a team, you have a partnership. Games like cribbage, canasta, pinochle, bridge, all require partners. And my personal favorite, euchre. I have seen marriages dissolve over a hand of euchre, and that's why I always counsel that it's guys against gals, never husband and wife partners against other husbands and wives. It is true that a single person can win a hand at euchre alone. In fact, it's called a loner hand, but highly unlikely statistically for a single player to win an entire game alone. And so it is with the game of life, at least for the human species. There are some critters who are born ready to go out on their own. I think seahorses are like that. Most of them are eaten early on. The human species has not evolved that way. Human infants require care, won't survive very long at all without complete and total care. And that nurturing goes on through childhood and in our modern day world, really for a couple of decades, for a child to develop his or her full God-given potential. That is how the game of life is played out in the human sphere. The title of our message today is Parental Partners, because they're required. They're a part of the mix when it comes to a well-developed human being. Those who have been blessed with parental partners along life's way know how critical that has been. Anybody who says they pulled themselves up by their own bootstraps is the most deluded of fools. Everyone who's ever been anything was given a hand up, either by devoted, loving parents or by surrogates, somebody, because that is how we were created. And all of the things that go into the development, our teachers, our churches, they're partnerships in our development. And if we forget about that, we forget about God, because God's love reaches us most intimately and immediately through our parents, for most of us, and through our mothers in particular. God commands us in the Ten Commandments to honor our mothers and our fathers. We saw last week what happens when we forget about our Heavenly Father, when we forget about God, when we become prideful in our hearts and ascribe all of our good fortune to ourselves. We cut ourselves off from His protective and providential care. We saw how that always leads us to being exiled in one way or another from the promised land, which is the Bible's way of saying the full life, the good life. But if there's a redeeming value to this sort of discipline, it is that if pride gets us into trouble, then it humbles us and reminds us of our need and where to look and where to turn. And when we turn back to God, He will lead us back to the promised land. So it is that it is important to remember our parents and to honor them in keeping with the Ten Commandments, because bad things happen when we cut ourselves off from good and godly mothers and fathers. And that's why St. Paul wrote, "Children, obey your parents in the Lord, for it is right. Honor your father and mother, which is the first commandment with a promise that it may go well with you." It's in our enlightened best interest to honor our mothers and fathers. That is the ideal. It's not always achieved, but it is the ideal nevertheless. Today we're going to take a look at Jesus' parents and their parental partnership in His life. Jesus may have been God's son, but He depended upon earthly parents for His well-being, to wrap Him in swaddling clothes against the cold, to feed Him so that He didn't starve to death as an infant, and in many other ways depended upon godly parents to raise Him up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. And that is exactly what they did. Mary was a wonderful mother. As we read, Joseph, he could have left Mary when she ended up pregnant without his participation, but no, he recognized an innocent life in need and stuck with his obligation he provided as a humble carpenter of home and food for a growing family that came to include several children. Between Jesus' birth narratives in the Bible and the beginning of his ministry as a 30-something adult, there's only one story in the Bible about his childhood, just one, and it is our text for today. In it, we gain a glimpse of his family life just before he leaves childhood and enters adulthood. He's 12 years old. When he's 13, he will go through his bar mitzvah, and then he will become accountable for his actions. Prior to that, it's his dad's responsibility. So be careful. Don't let your kids steal your car keys and sneak out of the house and get themselves in an accident. Somebody gets hurt, because they aren't going to be sued, Mom and Dad. We are. That's why in a bar mitzvah service at 13 years of age, the liturgy includes a prayer of thanksgiving given by the father, thanking God that he is no longer responsible for his children's actions. But I digress. Our text begins. Every year, his parents went to Jerusalem for the feast of Passover. When he was 12 years old, they went up to the feast according to the custom. Jesus' parents were people who kept the customs of their faith tradition. They did it when he was born. When he was 8 days old, he was circumcised according to the customs of his people. And now as he's growing up, they go to Jerusalem 3 times each year for 3 feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles. Israel is roughly the size and shape of Vermont, a very small area, and it wasn't undue hardship for families to make a pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where they would stay for these feasts that could last up to a week. And, of course, later on, we shouldn't be surprised when we read about a grown-up Jesus, how custom governed his decisions. We read when he went to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, and on the Sabbath day, he went into the synagogue, as was his custom. Where do you think these customs come from? His parents, most likely his mother, his mom. They were partners in his religious and spiritual development. They had their part to fulfill, and they fulfilled it. Jesus had his part to fulfill, and we find he was very eager to launch into it. After the feast was over, while his parents were returning home, the boy Jesus stayed behind in Jerusalem, but they were unaware of it. Well, Jesus is 12 years old. You know how 12 years old, they run in packs. He's with the Nazareth contingent. The feast is over. They're heading back to Nazareth. And the parents assume he's running around with his friends. Not a problem. He'll show up when he gets hungry. They travel all day until the night begins to fall, and they stop to cook food and make camp. No Jesus. And they start scurrying around and asking their friends and his friends if they've seen him. Nobody has seen him. Oh, we have a problem now. Thinking he was in their company, they traveled on for a day. They began looking for him among their relatives and friends. When they did not find him, they went back to Jerusalem to look for him. You can imagine what a fitful night's sleep that was, a day's journey from Jerusalem. The next day they travel all the way back. Now it's nighttime. Can't search for him. Another fitful night of sleep. The next morning, asking around, one thing leads to another. They finally, thankfully, after their imaginations have gotten carried away with him, they locate him. After 3 days, they found him in the temple courts, sitting among the teachers, listening to them and asking them questions. Everyone who heard him was amazed at his understanding and his answers. 12 years old, and Jesus already, it can be seen, he's a prodigy. Something special about Jesus, and he can't contain it. His parents were obviously aware of it. They'd helped to cultivate this spirituality in him. They were parental partners in his religious development. They know about it, but they are now not quite so as impressed as the others. Panic is giving way to another emotion. When his parents saw him, they were astonished. His mother said to him, "Son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you." His parents were astonished not by his understanding like all the other people. They were astonished that their otherwise model son had so thoroughly disrespected them and subjected them to anxious, fretful worry, needless worry. They couldn't understand it. Heavens, he could have told them he was going to stay an extra day. Now they wanted to know what he had to say for him. His answer is kind of classic, I think. He says, "Why were you searching for me?" He asked. "Didn't you know I had to be in my father's house?" It almost sounds like a flippant, smart-aleck kid answering his parents. I don't read it that way, mostly because I don't see this Jesus in the Bible. I think he's like, there's many pictures of Jesus in the Bible. We've seen the compassionate Jesus. We've seen the angry Jesus. We've seen the suffering Jesus, all those pictures. Here's a picture of clueless Jesus. Well, he just assumed they understood. I got a special spark. I got this thing in me. You know it. Did you know I had to be in my father's house? Who would think a 12-year-old's going to hang out with a preacher, But that's the kind of kid he was. And he just assumed they understood. But they didn't. But they did not understand what he was saying to them. Is there anybody here who's raised adolescents or have them now that did not understand why their kids did what they did? They did not understand how they tried to explain themselves. Well, you're in great company. You're in the company of Mary and Joseph. They did not understand. But they were relieved to find him alive and well, and they were glad to find out he wasn't intentionally cruel with them. And maybe they were even a little bit proud once they got over their anger to see that the crowds were amazed with he's my son. Then he went down to Nazareth with them and was obedient to them. See, he wasn't a disrespectful kid. He was an obedient child, honoring his parents and keeping with the commandments by obeying them. This partnership between parents, child, and faith leads to a healthy and whole family life. His mother, we read, treasured all these things in her heart. I'm reminded of this quote, I love it, by Mark Twain in our bulletin. "My mother had a great deal of trouble with me, but I think she enjoyed it." Jesus caused his mom some trouble, but she treasured these things in her heart, and Jesus grew in wisdom and stature and in favor with God and men. This is my first Mother's Day without my mother's earthly presence. We laid her to rest this past September, and I, after she died and as the service was approaching, I was looking forward to it. My dad's services, his send-off 14 years prior, I really wasn't looking forward to that. I was just thinking, I'm going to have to stand there 2 hours, greet people, wait an hour, then 2 more hours. It was such a blast. I saw people I hadn't seen for years. The time went by so fast. We were having a great time. We went overtime, and the people in our small town working at the funeral home understood and said, just go ahead and have a great time. So I was really looking forward this time. Who's going to show that I haven't seen for a long time? And I wasn't disappointed. Mr. Hughes showed up, my 6th grade teacher, who I haven't seen for 3-4 decades, really. That is way back. And I thought, boy, that's really nice that he was here for me, but he really couldn't have been there for me. If you think about it, he wasn't there when my dad died. And how many students does a careerist educator have? You'd be going to funerals all the time. And I realized he wasn't there for me. He was there for my mother. He was, when I saw him, he was holding something. I had brought 2 props because I did my mom's eulogy. One was my doctoral dissertation, and one was my 7th grade report card, which is suitable for framing, as you can see, and resides in my office. And since we're going to have sharing day now, so I'll share it with my fellow students here. But, yeah, I mean, they were at the first service, but I thought you might want to look at it for confirmation. Second reporting period is kind of interesting. I was in 6 classes, and I got 3 C's and 3 F's. What? Mr. Hughes is holding that when I see him, and he goes, "This is not a good reflection on me. This is the year after I had you." And you have to wonder how you go from that to this. He knew how that happened, and that's why he was where he was that day. My mom, she did not wait for a parent-teacher meeting to meet with teachers. She called them all the time. She was really kept a pulse on my progress through life, and she would call teachers, usually make a meeting after school when I was there, had to listen to the speech. You know, some parents, an educator will say, well, your child's misbehaving in class, cutting up as somewhat immature, and they'll get offended. How dare you? Not my mom. She assumed whatever they said I had done. She said, I want you to discipline him. Call me. I'll discipline him when he gets home. And she meant it, and that's how I was raised. So when I would start acting out in class, an educator just had to look at me like, you know who's going to find out about this. And I would straighten right up. I think almost every educator, I'm big on them, almost all of them go into that business. They have a passion for the molding of young lives. They have a talent for that. They understand that education is a partnership between the student, the educator, and the parent. You take one of those components out, and you've got a severely hamstrung education. And they appreciate parents who are partners in the development of their children. They know how critical it is. They understand that's how you go from that report card to that dissertation. That my mom earned that every bit as much as I did, which is why the first page has a dedication to my mother. My mom never wore her faith on her sleeve. It just wasn't her style. But I'll tell you, she made sure the church, her family went to church every Sunday. This is a fact. I received a 16-year pin for perfect Sunday school attendance when I was 18 years old, heading out the door to go to college. And they didn't start counting until you were 2. That is a fact. We grew up in the youth program. I went to church camp, and I still go to church, the same church camp. I show up every year. It's become kind of a custom with me. Customs that were cultivated in me by my parents. And now I became a preacher. When I was growing up, Mom always said, be a doctor, be a lawyer. They make the big bucks. When she found out I was going to be a preacher, even she could not have hoped for that. I'm telling you, my mom laying up treasures in heaven beat out laying up treasures on earth, hands down. And she blew my cover wherever we went, and she was very proud. Well, she's in heaven with Dad now, but I still feel the need to honor them in death, even as in life. And I hope you feel the same way about your parents. A lot of people feel that their moms and dads are the absolute, hands-down best in the world, and I am one of them. I know how you feel, and I'm glad, I hope you feel that way about your folks, or your surrogate parents. And if you were fortunate to have such, I hope that today finds a card, a visit, a call to them. They aren't going to be around forever, you know. And even after they're gone, you can send up an undying message of love, maybe like this one here today. Please Please rise.